get started. Thanks, Chris. Today's session will be recorded, so if you needed to drop off for any reason or had tech issues, there will be a recording sent, and to those who can't attend today, we also share the recording. Just a reminder that this is a practitioner development forum, so designed for certified practitioners. So if you are listening to the recording, it is one that we would ask you to keep for the practitioner audience. But what you learn in here obviously can be shared much more widely than just practitioners. Oh, lovely to see everyone. Oh, I'm just going to scroll through to my next page. Okay, perfect. So I think I know many of you in here. You give me a wave if you're a recent practitioner. Let's just say last 3 or 6 months. I have some new faces. Hello, lovely to see you or meet you again. I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me 2 minutes. Here we go. So you'll notice that even though I work for Herman, today's session is really presented with my background as a psychologist working in education and under my the work that I do working with kids and parents and educators. And so most of the time I'm working with Herman, and some of the time I also work with parents, educators, and young people in the space of neurodiversity. And so I'm coming at it from that particular lens as I share it today. And I'm also going to link neurodiversity to whole brain thinking and the HBDI. I'm just going to open the chat. I will have the chat. Today's pretty much more of a webinar. I don't really have breakouts planned unless something comes up that we might need to chat about. But I will be talking to this topic and helping you talk to this topic. We are getting a lot of questions about neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and whole brain thinking and the HBDI. And so this is really to help you answer some of those questions, and you might already be answering these questions in this way. All right, so I've now set myself up in the background. As I said, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat for me. I will be checking it over there every now and then. If you don't know me, I'll just do a quick introduction. My name is Rosie. I have been working with Herman for 14 years. This is my 14th year now. Can't get rid of me. I love whole brain thinking and the HBDI. I find it a very powerful tool, particularly in this conversation around people who are neurodiverse and neurodivergent. Me and myself, I actually am also neurodivergent. So when I was a younger person, I had learning difficulties that would be best categorized in the diagnosis of dyslexia, among other things. And it really drove me to understand why my brain was working differently. And one of the things that I came across was whole brain thinking in that pursuit to understand the way my brain was working differently. And I actually found whole brain thinking and the HBDI to be one of the most powerful strategies to help me overcome some of my challenges. And that's the work that I do with young people as well in that space. So today, though, I want to talk to you about neurodiversity, the concept, the topic, and how it links to whole brain thinking and the HBDI. I've got some notes here, and I apologize for the croaky voice. You know, it's winter. So I got some stats here, and if it's numbers, and if you know me, you'll know I always have to refer to numbers because they don't pop into my head straight away. Statistics tell us that between 15 to 20% of the population is neurodivergent. We had 130 people register for this particular webinar, which means anywhere from 20, 25-ish people in the audience are neurodivergent in some way. And what does that mean? It means that their brain functions differently to what we call the neurotypical population. So what I want to be able to do today, why am I here, is to help you confidently explain what neurodiversity is, what neurodivergence is, and how it can link to whole brain thinking, specifically in the diversity and inclusion space. That's where it really fits quite nicely. So I want to tell you and talk to you about how they're powerful within that context. So what are we going to achieve? There are a couple of things I want to be able to answer questions about neurodiversity, cognitive diversity, and the HBDI. I also want us to be very mindful of language. And this is an evolving construct. So the language that I was using 6 years ago when my child was born is very different language to what I use now. So I'm just saying that to show the difference in the words we use and how we describe these things is changing. And even from last year when I ran this session to this year, I've made updates to reflect the changes in the ways we talk about this in general and in the public. So I also want to talk to you about the paradigm shift of neurodiversity and connect where HBDI and whole brain thinking does fit and where it does not fit. So the way we're going to get there is 3 parts to what I want to talk about. I'm curious to find out a bit about why you're here, so I'm just going to get you to share that in the chat in a minute. I'm going to describe what I mean about neurodiversity, neurodivergence, cognitive diversity, and some other words out there like neurotypes. And then the last thing I want to do is talk about the connection between whole brain thinking, the HBDI, and the neurodiversity paradigm. So they're the 3 key things. Which leads me to this question. So this would be best answered in the chat. And it also helps me improve this for next time, because I asked this last time and I really want to know what is important to you in the sense of what do you think you or your audience want to know? What are the questions that are coming up in the sessions or even before the sessions? So sometimes in the promotion stage of talking about this, you get questions about it. Sometimes when you're in a session and you're actually debriefing the HBDI, you find a member self-reports that they are neurodivergent. How do you respond to that? So I'm just going to give us a minute to capture the questions that you might have. Feel free to add them. And then I'm going to hopefully answer those in the next 50 minutes. Thank you. Some wonderful questions coming through. I'll give you another bit of time. Thanks, Cheryl. Yes, all of the above. It's really interesting that there's going to be a very broad background of people with experience in this space and very new to this space. And so I think I'll try and cover all of those different spectrums. And I'm hoping that how to work. I think a lot of what I'm going to cover does cover a lot of these questions. I'm just going a lot about how to engage, and how does it influence the profile, definitely, the relevance of it, how to work with it. Yep, so the engagement piece, all of the above. Some quadrant preferences, more neurodiverse than others. Participants report they are neurodivergent. A participant reports they're neurodivergent. How does the HBDI apply? Okay, so thank you. If you've got more questions, feel free to add them in here and I'll come back to them. So we're going to start, sorry, croaky. I've got tea, lemon and ginger. Okay. I'm going to start with a definition. And as I said, language is very important. And I'm also going to caveat this recording, because we're recording, by saying that the language I'm using now in, where are we, were July 2024, might change by July 2025. That's how much this space is shifting and how quickly it's changing. So I'm just putting that caveat out there. But this is what we know at the moment. So what is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity refers to the range of differences within the function of the human brain. So it's the concept that different brains work differently. So thinking of the functions of the brain, we know there was a wonderful presentation given last time by Jenny Lee Williams on neuroscience, and she talked about a lot of the functions of the brain. The brain controls our thoughts and decisions. It controls our memories. It controls movement, balance, the sensations of pain, autonomic functions like your breathing, your heart rate, your temperature, organ function, speech and language function, the fight or flight response. All of these are functions of the brain. And what neurodiversity says is that each of us in the room, in the virtual room, have different ways that our brain functions in this space. Neurodiversity was thought to the phrase came from an Australian, Judy Singer. She was a sociologist, and she was really trying to look at ways to promote equality and inclusion of neurological minorities in the 1990s. She was trying to find a way that was more a positive way to include the ways that we are different, rather than the traditional ways that we had described people whose brains function differently. And I'll talk about that shift in a minute. So she was trying to increase acceptance and inclusion, recognize that our brains work differently, and that there are differences in every brain. What's interesting, though, is that even though as an audience we are all neurodiverse, within this audience, some of us and some of our brains actually diverge from the norm. So neurodiversity is the first word I'm going to teach you. The second word is neurodivergence. It's a different word. Neurodivergence means that a brain's processing or function diverges from the typical brain. So when we are talking about neurodiversity, so this is where language is critical. When you're talking about neurodiversity, every person is neurodiverse. Some of the population are neurodivergent. And neurodivergent, if you look at the bell curve, that how we traditionally diagnose that is using a bell curve. We say, here's what's typical in the middle of the bell curve here. This is where the typical function of a brain looks like. Some brains are less typical. And we call those brains and the function of them the neurodivergent brain. And my brain, it has been diagnosed as neurodivergent. One of the ways my brain is neurodivergent is something called aphantasia, which is the inability to produce mental images. And my brain just can't do that. And I might go into a bit more about that later, but I'll talk to different ways the brains can be neurodivergent. So autism and ADHD are common diagnoses, or they're actually called neurotypes. We'll get to that in a minute. That are ways in which the brain is neurodivergent. So we've got neurodiversity, where all our brains work differently. And then from there, we also have neurodivergence, where your brain works differently from the typical functioning brain, what is considered typical. The third kind of statement to make is that although we're all neurodiverse, some of us are neurodivergent with diagnosed neurotypes. So this is the language that we're currently using at the moment. And a neurotype is the autism, dyslexia, developmental disabilities. So if we look over here, what neurodiversity and the neurodivergence paradigm is trying to say is that we want to look at your brain and we want to look at how your brain diverges from the typical. And there are lots of ways your brain can diverge from the typical. I even had to write them all down here to give you some examples because there's just so many of them. So, sorry, your brain can be different in the way that the synapses prune. In fact, in people with autism, one of the things they found is that their brain doesn't prune away the synapses that aren't needed. And one of the reasons they can experience sensory overload is because their brain is actually not filtering out what might not be relevant for them, but it's actually taking on everything out there. There's examples where people with autism can hear electricity because their brain isn't filtering out something that the typical population can't process and hear. So ways your brain can diverge: synaptic pruning differences, filtering differences. So how we filter information, what we take in, how the neurotransmitters function. So that can often relate to conditions such as depression, anxiety. Sometimes there's reduced activity in particular brain areas. So with dyslexia, they've looked at connections between activity and certain parts of the brain not having the same type of activity. There can be structural differences in your brain. So the actual form and structure of the brain can be different in individuals. They can also be compensatory mechanisms. So where you might have a brain where they don't actually have a particular function, or even you can Google this and look up people who have only half a brain. they still can function very well because their brain has compensated, even though they don't have the physical part of a particular brain, and they can work through that through compensation. Altered activation of neural pathways. So the highways that you create can be different. The highways that you created and how they fire together, the neuroplasticity can be different in different brains. The plasticity is different, the brain size is different. Working memory differences can also appear, how the amygdala functions, altered brain connectivity. Dopamine regulation is another way that the brains can work differently, and that's linked to findings in ADHD. They investigate the different ways dopamine works in the brain of an individual with ADHD. How the basal ganglia works. In Tourette syndrome, there's thought to be some connection between how the basal ganglia works and that condition as well. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of research, and it's really in its infancy. It's not well defined yet. When you go and sort of look these things up, it says, well, there's this idea that in Tourette's the basal ganglia works differently, but it's actually a lot more complex than that because there's a lot going on in the brain. But this is what people are researching at the moment. Yes, Karen's asking, is borderline personality disorder a neurotype, please? How does it fit into this diagram or not? Yes, it is. Any diagnosis that is a neurodivergent diagnosis would be one of these neurotypes. There's more than is on the list here. This is just an example of some common ones. So anything where your brain is functioning differently. So how do we get to a neurotype? Well, how we get to a neurotype is through an assessment, through a standardized normative assessment. And so they often don't diagnose a neurotype through your brain working differently. They do a self-report, they take a questionnaire, and you go through an assessment process, and you're diagnosed with a particular neurotype. And so what they're trying to connect is what the neurotype and what the neurodivergence or what the differences are happening in relation to the brain. And there are many, many different neurotypes. So neurotypes really are a name of a collection of symptoms, or a collection of behaviors or processes that describe particular ways of processing in the world. So the two that I talk to mainly are autism and ADHD. But there are many more, like Karen's mentioned, borderline personality disorder. But any one of those disorders, if we want to use that language, is going to fall or be described potentially as a neurotype, or the way the brain is working and functioning differently. So the reason that this has become quite important is that it's a bit of a paradigm shift. You'll even hear in the language that I use. So we used to think, or many years ago, actually, in the scheme of things, but there was a thinking out there that the Earth was flat. We can see the horizon, it must be flat. But we then learned by looking at the Earth from a very different perspective, from outer space, that the Earth was actually round, or a sphere. And so I want you to think about this shift in neurodiversity as a similar shift. We've predominantly talked about people having deficits or disorders or dysfunctions and problems, sicknesses, illnesses, things like that. But what neurodiversity is trying to say is that there is a different paradigm we can use to understand these differences, and it relates to how the brain functions differently. So the whole concept or paradigm really of neurodiversity is a paradigm shift. And this is why it's important to understand. So I'm going to use one example, just another little drink of tea. I'm going to use autism as the example of this, and how autism is reshaping the paradigm of neurodiversity. So autism, as I said before, is a way that the brain diverges from the typical. And how they do that, they have the bell curve, and you go through a diagnostic procedure, and that results in a diagnosis of autism. Now, in the past, and not that long ago, to be honest, when I was first studying psychology, in fact, when you learned about autism, you learned it through the medical deficits model. What's wrong with you? And you learned about most things in psychology through a deficits model. So that's on the left there, and the the way that it was taught was there's deficits with empathy, with social difficulties. They're abnormal. They have emotional outbursts and they have learning dysfunction. Sorry, I should say dysfunctions. And then autism was kind of categorized in the space of, well, they used to have Asperger's and autism. Now there's no difference. There's no differentiation. We don't have Asperger's and autism anymore. We just have autism. And they talk about you're a high functioning autistic or you're a low functioning autistic. And they're not very nice words, really, when you look at it. And so the autistic community really started to advocate for this neurodiversity because they're saying there's not actually anything wrong with us. We are just different to you. And so what has emerged in the last probably decade, or a bit more than a decade, particularly in the last decade though, is a neurodifferences model. So how are you different? How does your brain work differently in terms of communication, sensory processing, your behaviors, how you regulate emotions and your executive functioning? And what the autistic community talks about now is that instead of having this dichotomy of high functioning autistic, low functioning autistic, it's actually much more diverse than that. And they talk about the diversity within the autistic brain and how the brain differentiates itself from the typical brain. And so one of the really powerful things, if you want to go into this space more, is to look up the social model of disability. The social model of disability talks about how people are purely disabled by their environment. So if you think about someone who's in a wheelchair, they are disabled by the environment because you put stairs in to get to the front of your office. Now, if you didn't have stairs, they wouldn't be disabled by that. They could scoot around wherever they needed to go. So the concept of a disability is now talked a lot about using this concept of the social model of disability. And it's really important for us as facilitators to understand that, because what that says is the environment we create can help hamper, hinder, or unlock different challenges in people. Because by creating, if we put stairs in every office, people who can't walk upstairs are disabled by that. So it's an environmental model that says, let's look at our environment, let's look at what we're trying to do and how we are actually making this harder for people because of what the situations and environments we're creating for them. So one of the, that was just a little aside, but it's really, if you are in this space, the social model of disability is a very, very powerful way to look up and a lens to understand differences amongst individuals. So what we're trying to do though, and particularly at the example here of autism, is try to understand differences through a more positive lens and through a more inclusive lens, and through a lens that really celebrates the difference rather than the deficit. And autism is just one example, but many, many other types of conditions that we've traditionally diagnosed are on a pathway to becoming more understood and more recognized for the difference that they bring. So it kind of, now I've explained neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and the neurotypes that come out of those. Where does whole brain thinking and the HBDI fit in this conversation? And before I answer that question, I'm just going to pause, and I'd like to share in the chat of where you think it fits. If you have a thought about this, because I'm going to share what I think, obviously, but where the connections are. But where do you think whole brain thinking fits in this conversation? How does it fit in this conversation? So if you've got a thought about that, if you don't, that's fine too. But if you do have a thought about that, you can just pop it in the chat for me. I like what Rachel, hi Rachel, I haven't seen you for a while, Rachel. Rachel's saying about the differences and strengths. So whole brain thinking has always been a model talking about your preferences, your strengths, as well as the diversity. So we've always used this language. We've been using this language since Ned started. So that's a good link. I agree there. And Karen's saying that we can use all quadrants, 100%. So this isn't a model about what you can or can't do. It's about the ability to use all. It's a thinking model. not about neurodivergence. Absolutely. That's what David's telling us. The concept of diversity, yeah, this word diversity definitely links. Commonalities with neurodivergence and thinking preference. Yeah, I'm going to talk to that more. Understanding how thinking preferences impact communication. Function is not about preference. Yes, thanks, Jess. Okay, there's a big difference between how your brain functions, the functioning of your brain, and the preferences of your brain. In my example of aphantasia, when I'm working with kids and their parents to describe this, I often talk about this light switch analogy. And the analogy in itself isn't particularly robust because what we're learning about the brain changes and improves a lot. But how I explain it is your brain it's like it's filled with millions of light switches. And when you have a brain that doesn't work in the typical way, it's because there's something going on with your light switch. Now, it could be a number of things. It could be that your light switch, it doesn't want to turn on. You can't get it to turn on. So in my example of not being able to produce and see in mental imagery, I just can't turn that light switch on. But it doesn't mean that it's not there. Sometimes the light switch is on all the time and you can't turn it off ever. So when you think of the sensory overload challenges, people with sensory processing challenges, their light switch is always on, always processing information from their environment. They can't switch it off and they want it to turn it off, but it's always turned on. Sometimes the light switch is on, but it's faulty, so it's dim. So, it's got a dimmer switch on it and you're trying to turn it on, but it's just not bright enough. In language challenges, sometimes expressive language differences, how you express and communicate is different. So you've got the light switch there, but it might be dim as an example, or it's just not turning on as easily as it is for some people. But when you can start to talk about and understand the ways the brain functions differently, you can start to talk about the turning on of these light switches. And again, this is just what's thought to happen. A lot of this stuff is very much in its infancy, but we can use this as an analogy to understand the brain and how it's having a challenge. We also know that you can create new light switches for light switches that aren't working very well in people who have traumatic brain injuries. They've lost function in a particular part of the brain, but they actually develop competence in doing something. So think of your brain as having these light switches and having these challenges of switching them on and off and things like that. And this is really where whole brain thinking and HBDI can fit powerfully, because it's a strategy. It's a strategy for understanding, and it's a strategy for improvement and learning and taking action. So let me just explain, and to the audience that already knows this, what is whole brain thinking and the HBDI. The first thing is to make sure you always know you're describing two different things here. Whole brain thinking is a model that represents our thinking processes. So it is related to the brain, but it's related to the thinking brain. It's a model that represents one of the brain's functions, and that function is how your brain thinks. And because your thinking processes are one aspect of how your brain works, it means it falls into this umbrella of neurodiversity, because how we think is one way that our brains are different. How we think is a part of how our brains work, and it's a part of how our brains are different to each other. Ned created his 4-quadrant model to describe the thinking processes, blue, green, red, yellow, A, B, C, D, analytical, practical, relational, experimental thinking. And so it's essentially a model to describe the cognitive processes of our brain. The HBDI measures and identifies the thinking processes according to the whole brain thinking model. So we have a model, and we also have an instrument that measures our thought processes according to that model. Now, that shouldn't be new, but I'll continue on to say that why is whole brain thinking, the HBDI, relevant in the neurodiversity space? Well, we're talking about cognitive diversity. So if you ever are asked, where does whole brain thinking fit in this conversation? It's around cognition. That means thinking. And so we measure cognition using the HBDI in adults over 18 years. The other great way that whole brain thinking fits and is powerful in this neurodiversity space is that the HBDI is a preference-based instrument. It's not a normative instrument. So in order to get a diagnosis of those neurotypes I described before, you have often been through a normative assessment. A normative assessment says this is the norm, and you differ from the norm. A normative assessment said this is what is the ideal, and this is where you are away from the ideal. But the HBDI is not based on a bell curve. It's not a normative assessment. It's a preference-based tool. And so it's not saying this is what we're looking for. This is the ideal picture we want to have. It's saying this is how you are different. The HBDI is a degree of preference instrument. So one of the great things about the HBDI, and one of the reasons I've stuck around for so long, is that it isn't a dichotomy instrument or a dichotomous instrument. It says you can actually have preferences for all 4 quadrants, or you can have preference for 1 quadrant. And it isn't good or bad if you have all 4. If you have 1, there are implications for your thought processes and how you work in your world, but there isn't a better or a worse. You could be any on the spectrum. And if you look at the picture here, you know, this just gives you a bit of a snapshot of all the different ways your thinking preferences of the different stakeholders out there could manifest. One of the great things about HBDI is that it recognizes you can adopt thinking agility and access preferences you don't prefer. I'm going to, please indulge me, I do it all the time, but I want you to fold your arms for me. And you'll have a look down and you'll see one arm's over the top of the other. Mine's right over left. Hello, if that's you, give me a wave. If that's right over left. If you're left over right, you can give me a wave. That's not me. But now unfold your arms. I'd like you to do it again. Fold your arms, put the other arm on top. I always use this in my explanations. I'm saying this is about preferences, not what you can and can't do. So when we're talking about HBDI, you fold your arms and put the other arm on top. Yeah, okay, it might not feel so great. It might have taken more time, more effort, more attention, more energy. In the neurodivergent space, they talk about spoons. There's a lot of this language about, I don't have enough spoons today. But really what we're trying to say is that you don't have the energy and attention, but it's not saying you can't do it. And so HBDI is wonderful because it says, you know, for me, I laugh every time I do this. I have to write numbers down. I'm like, I can't remember them. I just write them here. You know, blue quadrant, numerical. It's not my preferred space to be, but it doesn't mean I can't do it. And the last thing about HBDI is that it can change. Your preferences now might differ, and they may not as well. Some people do change, some people don't change. It's related to motivation, need to change, desire to change, significant life events, but your preferences can change. And so if there's a particular pattern that is not helping you, you can make changes to that. So we're talking, I guess, about cognitive diversity using HBDI. Let's get to now some of the questions that you asked me earlier. Oh, time check. Okay, we're doing well. How do we respond to these questions about HBDI, whole brain thinking, and neurodiversity? So how does HBDI connect to neurodiversity? I'm going to answer these. How does HBDI relate to neurodivergence? Can they work well together? Can neurodivergent individuals complete the HBDI? Is it valid? Where's the research? Do different neurotypes have a certain profile? We know neurotypes meaning ADHD, autism, or anything in that category. Can neurodivergent individuals adapt their thinking preferences? I included that one because I've got asked that before. And the last question that you guys asked too, which was, how do you adapt sessions for neurodivergent stakeholders? So what I'm going to do is share a couple of answers. I'm just going to check. Forgot my next slide. Oh, there it is. Okay. So how does whole brain thinking connect to neurodiversity? I've actually taught you this one already. Anyone want to have a go at answering it? Anyone brave enough out there? How many people in the room? 43. Anyone brave enough to have a try if you were asked this? I love it, Jennifer. Thanks, Jennifer. So the neurodiversity talks about how the brain functions. One of the functions of the brain is thinking. And so how it relates is that whole brain thinking is a model to describe the thinking function of the brain. That's one example. That's great. How does whole brain thinking relate to neurodivergence? Can they work well together? Anyone want to have a go at that? And you can come off mic if you want to, if you prefer to express. Oh, thanks, Chris.
Rosie, hi. Sally here from Rethink Dyslexia.
Hi, Sally.
Hi. Yes, absolutely. It works well. And I've been using it with our clients. We've been using it for the last 6 months.
Yep.
As our tool of preference. And yeah, it's been received really well.
Yep.
And we've also got some grant funding that we've applied for to do research for it. So with La Trobe University. So we're waiting on confirmation of that, so that we will actually have some research based on autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. They're our conditions.
Excellent. And what kind of things are you finding it works well? Like what can you give us an example?
The strengths and frustrations in the workplace is a really good tool for people to be able to look at particularly their strengths and consider how other people may be experiencing them as well. Most, because it is not a normative assessment, that is a massive win. People do the assessment and then feel really positive. We're also putting people through the thinker journey first as well. So the micro learning and the videos are working really well for dyslexics. And then our people that are, have autism, they are liking all the facts and the worksheets and all the information that they can go away with. So the fact that there's so many resources as well, that's also a really a big positive. But mostly the biggest part is that it's neuroaffirming in the context that their preferences and people are recognising that there's no deficit. Everyone is presenting in a way that is how they are currently, and then they can change their preferences and stretch their brain. So that's also quite encouraging for people. And we're linking that back with growth mindset as well in our workshops. So they sit really, as we all know, they sit really well together. The growth mindset approach, learning to learn and stretching yourself out of your comfort zone, and whole brain thinking, they're really complementary tools. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing, Sally. That's wonderful. And you actually summarise it so much more nicely than I would have said it.
It's much easier for me to talk than mine. So thank you for the invitation to talk.
That's so wonderful. I'm going to be keeping in close contact because I'd love to hear how the research goes and what you're discovering. But many of you out there, and I open this carefully because I know some of you don't have much experience. You're here, kind of new, but some of you might be working a lot in this space. And so it's really great to hear those examples of what it's actually looking like, particularly related to these first two questions. How are you finding it connecting in powerful ways? And secondly, does it work well together? And because it's non-normative, because it's preference-based, and the growth mindset stuff that Sally mentioned. So look up Carol Dweck if you haven't heard of it. It's really related to a lot of those positive constructs and works very well. Does anyone else want to share anything related to those two questions before I'll go through the others as well?
Just a quick build on the thinker journey is actually really helpful too for, I mean, all adults in adult learning principles. Some people like to get information early, but particularly people that have a little bit of learning anxiety or things like that, to be able to do that ahead of time, and also to be able to see where which videos they've got up to. So then as the workshop facilitator, program manager, I can then work one-on-one with people. And I've had like only 2 people that just found starting too difficult. And then I just sat with them and we did it together on an iPad. So the intervention, and those 2 people, one person was based on anxiety and the other person was based on severe dyslexia. So it was, you just found it a bit too confronting. But overall, we're finding it that having the information early and then doing the group debrief and then being able to go back to the videos and rewatch them is a really, really good tool as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Chris, thanks for that. I was just going to point out some of you who might have been earlier than 6-ish, well, there's been a couple of iterations, but earlier than 6 years ago, if you came through certification, you wouldn't have necessarily completed the thinker journey. There is a course and we have talked about it in the forums, the practitioner journey is a way for thinkers to learn about their profile, whole brain thinking, and their profile before they come into the classroom. Chris has just shared a fact sheet on it if you want to know more, if it's completely new to you, if you haven't been around for a little bit. And there's also a course in the practitioner portal for you called Using the Thinker Journey. And it allows you to complete the HBDI again. It allows you to go through the thinker journey yourself. And it gives you some examples and ways to apply that in the classroom as well. And so it is a very powerful way. It's going to answer question 6. How do you adapt your sessions? There's some examples of how that looks. So I'm going to just go through the other questions. I won't put anyone on the spot. Unless anyone likes to share, just give me a wave or let me know in the chat there. I'm looking at that as well. So the question 3, what I get asked or comes through, which is, can neurodivergent individuals complete the HBDI? Is it valid, and what's the research? So anyone can complete the HBDI who has an age-appropriate level of language comprehension, receptive and expressive comprehension, and is over the age of 18 years. So we don't differentiate and say, oh, well, this audience can do it and that audience can't do it. But if you're over the age of 18 years, so you're an adult, and you have age-appropriate levels of language comprehension, then you can complete the HBDI. So what does that mean? Well, you can read the questions and respond to the questions. So you understand what synthesizer means. And I use that as a funny example because when I asked my 18-year-old brother to do this the first time, he's like, what, isn't that like a piano from the 80s? I'm like, no, dude, no, it's not that synthesizer. But I'm just using that as an example. If you think your audience has lower literacy comprehension, then it's definitely worth getting in touch with us about whether they're the right audience for this instrument. But in those cases, excluding those cases, yes, you can use the HBDI with a particular audience. Sally just shared with us the example of the individual who was feeling anxious. And so she sat with her one-on-one to go through and perhaps remove some of that anxiety. So other things can get in the way of completing it, but they're able to complete the HBDI. So yes, neurodivergent individuals with appropriate levels of language comprehension can complete the HBDI. Do different neurotypes have a certain profile? Ooh, I'm going to come back to that one. Can neurodivergent individuals adapt their thinking preferences? So remember I talked about the light switch before? When you have a neurodivergence, the light switch is often, it's faulty and it doesn't work, or some people say it's not even there, it's not able to be turned on. But with a neurodivergent individual, they've actually had to adapt their thinking more than the rest of the population because they do this thing called masking. And so as long as you can think, you can adapt. As long as you can learn, you can adapt. So when you come up to, and this is often asked by well-meaning individuals who are working with neurodivergent populations, who see, flapping. Oh, they're flapping. What are they doing? And well, actually, they're trying to regulate themselves. So it's not about that they can't do something. It's about their strategy to do something. And so can neurodivergent individuals adapt their thinking? Absolutely, they can. And often, in most cases, in my experience of working in this space, they're adapting a lot more, which does have implications for how they fill in the survey. Just point that, I'm going to come back to that. So if you're a masker, if you mask yourself out there, it does impact how you respond to the questionnaires. How do you adapt your sessions for neurodivergent stakeholders? I've got a couple of points I'm going to share in a slide in a minute. And the other question, do different neurotypes have certain HBDI profiles? Well, let's have a think about that. These are 4 different profiles of 4 real people I've worked with. And what I'd love you to tell me on the chat or on the via mic, what is the commonality between these 4 profiles? What's common amongst them? Yes, all 4 quadrants are represented. If we consider across the 4 profiles, they are. The thing that's common amongst these 4 profiles is that they all have a diagnosis of ADHD, a confirmed diagnosis of ADHD. And the reason I show this and the reason I talk to this is that ADHD is not simply a preference of thinking for the yellow quadrant, as an example, or a over preference of thinking in the red quadrant. ADHD is a way, or is a challenge with how your brain regulates dopamine, as well as other inhibitory control mechanisms. But what's interesting is that even if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, your thinking can be very, very diverse. And this is what we don't research this because Herman, the company, and this is why I'm presenting as myself, don't have the consent to capture the privacy data of people and do this. But our stakeholders, like Sally just shared, in your situations, you might have that consent to be able to research or anonymously research. But what is interesting is that there is no profile for a neurotype. There is no profile for autism. There is no profile for depression, for anxiety, for ADHD. There is no one profile. But what is similar amongst all these divergences is that all of these people think. And all of these people think differently. And when they understand how they think differently through a model that is non-normative, or it's a preference-based model, it's a very powerful way to help them understand themselves and that difference. And so when you see an individual with ADHD with the strong blue and green preferences, that manifests itself in behaviors very differently to the D and the second profile here, high A and D quadrant. And it gives them another lens to make sense of these challenges that they've experienced often their whole lives. And it gives them language to help them be able to describe that. So no, there isn't a particular profile, there isn't a particular pattern. And Herman actually don't want to do that because, again, we're not a normative assessment. They've actually moved away from collecting normative data. So about 6 years ago, they stopped asking for simply male, female. They also you can choose not to add your gender to the HBDI questionnaire. Now, when I started working at Herman, we'd say, here's the average profile of a male and here's the average profile of a female. But Herman don't want to go down that track because it starts to do what's called norming. And it says, here's the norm. If you don't fit the norm, then the human brain goes, oh, what's wrong with you? So they've stopped doing that, and so much so that they don't actually want to norm against particular divergences because that's not the intent behind the tool. But what we can do is understand how thinking impacts the divergence and how that might play out. Now, I've come across people with autism as well, and one of the things that the assumptions that's made about autism is, oh, no red quadrant. But actually, people with autism have an oversupply often of red quadrant and empathy and connection. And sometimes that is masked a lot in their world. So that's just another example of how diverse the thinking preferences are with these different challenges that people face or the diagnoses that they have. Okay, second last slide. How do we apply this ethically? The first thing we need to do is really be careful with our language. We need to make sure we understand what neurodiversity is, what neurodivergence is, and if you were interested, even though they're not my favorite words, they compare, so the neurodivergent population to the neurotypical population. And so there's more language for you. We have the neurotypes, which is just another way to say these are the classifications of diagnoses. And we have neuroplasticity, which I haven't really talked about much today, but that's the concept that the brain can challenge and change in function. And I'm not very well researched in this area, but even in the brains of stakeholders who are neurodivergent, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and even in my own example of being neurodivergent, neuroplasticity has got me a long way. The fact that I can't see in pictures I've been practicing this diligently for the last 20 years, and I now can see in colors, or I can see in movement, where I couldn't see anything previously. So there are ways that you can develop the right strategies to overcome some of these challenges in some cases. Another way to apply this in your facilitation is around the strategies you use, and Sally actually summarized these quite nicely. So when I'm working with or if I know that there's a neurodivergent audience with a high proportion of neurodivergence, I give more time for learning. I would use the thinker journey. So I give them the ability to learn about themselves in their own time up front, and then come back one-on-one, even to the point of how they fill in the questionnaire. So I never, if the audience is neurodivergent, and a high proportion is neurodivergent, I actually start by teaching them what whole brain thinking is before I get them to fill in the questionnaire. Because this is an audience who's been pathologized often their whole life. You know, what's wrong with me? What's the problem? And so when they go to look at a survey, they're like, straight away, they're like, oh, I don't really want to fill this in. Or they mask, which is my second point, the second point here, because they've been told how they should think. And so often in this audience, I will describe the model, describe the quadrants, talk about it being a preference-based model, talk about there being no right or wrong, give them some examples, like show them some examples of the profile like this, and then say, now you're going to go away and fill in the survey and come up with your own profile. It's interesting in the strategy piece too, because I used to always say this, and this is a good tip for changing your strategy every now and then. I used to say, oh, do the thinking that requires the most effort and energy first. Now, one stakeholder with ADHD said to me, yeah, I do that. I do the stuff that I don't like first. But another one said, if I did the stuff I didn't like first, I'd never get started in the day. That's what gives me the dopamine to be able to do the rest of the stuff later on in the day. So there's no one strategy fits all. There's no one size fits all for every person. And that's, so when you're thinking about strategies and you're working with people, think, how could I do this differently? What might work for this person might not work for another person. So that was one of my examples. It made me laugh. I'm like, oh, okay, good point. I better change that. Sometimes you might need to start where you prefer in order to stretch where you don't. Other times you might need to start where you don't prefer in order to kind of engage yourself later with the parts that you do that come more easily. Think about your environment. Oh, sorry, one more thing on strategy. So one of my favorite strategies as an educator, think, pair, share. So in a group which is neurodivergent, or any group actually, giving processing time to think individually first, then share with a partner, then share with a group is one of the great strategies to help unlock the conversation. So highly neurodivergent groups are less likely to want to jump in and share straight away for very many reasons. But think, pair, share, you can Google it. It's a great strategy. Think on your own first, share it with a partner, and then let's share who's comfortable sharing with the whole group. Gets more sharing happening. Think about the social model of disability. Is there anything you creating in your environment that might be inhibiting learners? The methods you're using, the way you might be using or not using technology. Should you be using technology? Maybe you shouldn't be using technology. What are the different ways that the environment is helping and or hindering? And the best way to find that out, ask. Don't assume, like my strategy. Just ask what might work. How might this work best for you? How do we apply it? Masking and energy management. So think about how your stakeholders might feel the need to mask. And this applies to any audience. I was working with a group not so long ago, and the manager had said, leave your emotions at the door. Don't come to work if you're going to bring them. And that was quite challenging when we were debriefing HBDI, because no one had picked the emotional word and descriptor, but there was a lot of red quadrant thinking coming out of the group. And when someone shared this with me, I realized that the group had not selected the word emotional every time they'd been requested in the survey because of what the manager had said. And so if there is any bias, or if there is any judgment around any of the quadrants, and it might not be related to how you facilitate, it might just be what you're walking into in the culture of the organization or the group, masking is going to potentially happen. And so just be aware of that. And that's why describing the model up front is a good way to overcome that. And the last thing that I think the way that this is really powerfully applied is around whole brain thinking being the language of inclusion. So there is a lot of work done around this concept called the double empathy problem, that audiences who are non-neurodivergent don't understand or can't have empathy for audiences who are, particularly in the autism space. What whole brain thinking does is it provides a bridge to talk about, to have a common language to talk about thinking and talk about differences in thinking. Because whether you are divergent or not, whatever that divergence is, as long as you think, then you are able to have a conversation around how that thinking is similar and different to others. And so I think that's where whole brain thinking with the instrument, the HBDI, is very powerful, because it provides that common language and a language that helps you talk about what the quadrants bring. And I'll go back to Sally and saying that she said that, and what frustrates quadrants and the strengths of the quadrants, that conversation, it's all around inclusion and recognition and just in developing that understanding. So I've got 2 minutes left. I'd be curious if anyone would like to share. This sort of wraps up the session. My very last slide is some resources I'm going to share with you. Any other strategies that anyone else has out there? You can come off mute if you'd like to share that. But does anyone else have any other strategies? Because I'm definitely not going to be the only person working in this space. Has anyone else found a particular strategy to engage this group? Is there anything I might have missed that you were hoping for? Just let me know, either in the chat or you can come off mute. When I've got 1 minute to share, I'll wrap up my last slide.
Rosie, it's Sangeeta. I was just wondering, thank you, it's been an amazing session. I've learned so much. I was just wondering if there was anything that managers who, have team members who are neurodivergent following an HBDI workshop, is there anything that you suggest that they do to, help the ongoing understanding and support and communication?
Yeah, I think with managers, the main thing is about inclusion and recognition of difference and making sure there's no judgment around differences in thinking. So there is often judgment around, what they can't do, or frustrations. And I think it's around finding the language of, well, how is it different? And what strategies could they put in place to help? Like, the manager at the end of the day is there to help the team flourish. So is there something they could do differently? And again, with the strategies, there are so many of them out there. So ask the stakeholder, what kind of strategy would you like? What might work for you? I think that would be the main things. Does that give you some insight, Sangeeta?
Thank you. That's great.
So a couple of resources. I'm going to email these to you next week, the recording and all these links. So you'll have all of these links. And thanks, Sally's put another one in there as well. If you want to know more about autism, there is a wonderful, completely free self-paced course called Reframing Autism. It's called Autism Essentials. And it's through the organization Reframing Autism. And if you want to be more knowledgeable in this space around autism, it is a wonderful course. So I highly recommend that if you want to learn more about it. And they talk about neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and with the lens of autism. The ICANN network is also a resource for people with autism. I have a blog out there on this topic, so you might share that with managers and leaders if you needed to. They're talking about neurodiversity being a competitive advantage. A great YouTube channel, How to ADHD. There's a lot of great strategies in that YouTube channel, and she puts out a lot of content to talk about ADHD in the workplace, in life. And there's a psychologist in Australia, and her company Onwards and Upwards Psychology has huge amounts of neuroaffirming resources. So I'll just leave you with my last comment, and that is that if you are working in the neurodiversity space, or you have that experience, you want to learn more, make sure that you are always seeking out what is called neuroaffirming resources, and resources that are really encouraging what we actually in Herman have always been doing, the diversity and the differences in the way we think, and using that in a helpful rather than unhelpful way to really bring this discussion of diversity and inclusion to the front line, because it is so powerful for these stakeholders. The feedback I get from these individuals who come and say, this was just so amazing, unlocked so much for me. And some of you might have had that experience too. It's very, very powerful when we do so ethically and positively. So thanks for tuning in. As I said, the recording will be available, and I look forward to seeing you all next time at our next session.
Thanks, Rosie.
Thank you, Rosie.
Rosie. See you later.
Thank you.